Okay, do I have power? Hey, great power up here. I just realized that when the schedule came out for the event, the title for this was "Who is God and What is He Like?" Below you see Nathan Betts. So I just want to say that wasn't meant to be an arrogant statement. That's just the way the schedule looks. But that's the title of this talk. Who is God and what is He like? Now, have you ever asked yourself that question before? Have you ever asked yourself the question, who is God? What is He like? What is He really like? A few years ago, I'll never forget talking to someone very close to me. This person was going through something really, really hard. And she said to me, I wonder what God is really like. I wonder if He's nice. I wonder if He even likes me. And it was a pretty intense conversation we had. But the reason why I say that I tell you that soundbite, is because the question, just as many other questions we've been discussing and exploring today, the question doesn't necessarily come only from theoretical or an intellectual spot. It's also a question of the heart. Who is God? Who is this God? What is He really like? So what I like to do is I want to look at a story found in the Bible. It's actually found in the New Testament in a book called Luke, which again, it's another book in which you have eyewitness stories of who Jesus Christ was, life teachings, death, resurrection of Christ. And I want to tell you a story from there, and then from there, draw out different points that speak to this question, who is God and what is He like? Here's the passage. It comes from Luke chapter 5. Verse 1. On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on Him, that's Jesus, to hear the word of God, He was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. And He saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, He asked him to put out a little from the land. And He sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when He had finished speaking, He said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word I'll let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching men." And when they brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed Him. Now, in order to understand this story, we need to understand the context. And the context is this. Jesus is talking to a crowd, and the crowd is growing greater and greater, and they're leaning in on Him. In other words, they're trying to catch every word Jesus is saying. But they're on a beach. It's a smelly landing area. Why? Now, why is it smelly? It's smelly because there are fishermen there. They're cleaning their nets. And that actually sort of should stop us for a moment, because it's interesting, because Jesus was seen as a rabbi. The thing is, He's not teaching in a holy place. He's not teaching in a synagogue or a temple. He's teaching in actually a place that would just be sort of unremarkable, on a beach. And the fishermen there are not only, yes, it is smelly, but they're disgruntled. They're grumpy because they hadn't caught anything the night before. Jesus looks to Peter and then says, "Look, can I use your boat?" And he sits down in Peter's boat and sits. And this wouldn't be necessarily that odd or strange for a rabbi to be sitting. Rabbis often sat and taught, but it was, in some way a bit strange that he was sitting from a boat as the crowd grew greater and greater. So he sits down in the boat, and then Jesus says something to Peter that was absurd. He tells Peter to put his nets out into the deep. Now, let me just explain to you why this is a bit odd, actually really, really odd and absurd. Jesus is, the rabbi. He's sort of the holy guy, okay? Peter is a fisherman. That is what he does. That's his bread and butter. That's how he makes his money. So if I'm Peter, I'm actually probably thinking in this moment, "Look, Jesus, this is what I do. This is how I make money. I never tell you, Jesus, how to do holy stuff. Okay? I never tell you how to heal people or do miracles. Just leave me alone. I can take care of this. But it's more than that. Fish, back then, on the Sea of Galilee, this is Lake Gennesaret, it's part of the Sea of Galilee. Fish would not be out during the day. They are out at nighttime. During the day, they hide under rocks. At nighttime, that's when they're feeding. And not only that, they're not out in the deep. They're actually near the shore. That's where they're feeding, where the fresh water is coming in. So what Jesus is saying is just completely absurd. More than that, the nets, this gets into actually quite detailed scholarship. Their scholarship looked at the nets that they used for night fishing. And they were called trammel nets. They were linen nets. So if you just think for a moment, if you can visualize that, the nets into which these fish were going, if you were using them at daytime, the fish could see the nets. They were like linen nets. Are you with me? So Jesus was asking Peter to do something that would be utterly futile. That is why Peter looks at Jesus and says, Master, we toiled all night. Jesus, I don't think you get it. But he looks to Jesus and says, at your word, I'll put my nets down. And he does. And then something remarkable happens. Peter comes into a remarkable, dramatic catch of fish. Now you have to understand, for Peter, fish meant money. Okay? Every morning after they would catch their fish, these guys, they would take the fish down to the market and sell the fish. That's how they made the money. And on a day like this in which he had come up empty, he hadn't caught anything yet, I'm thinking he's probably going to be going home, and actually he might be in the doghouse with his wife because he has nothing to show for it. He has no food, no money. This is why the narrator, Luke, actually says Peter signaled. That's a very careful wording on Luke's part, because does anyone fish, or does anyone do a lot of stuff on the water, canoe, or do any of that kind of stuff? Okay, for those of you who do stuff on the water, you know that the voice travels 7 times faster further over water than on land. And for Peter, since fish meant money, this was a financial secret to be kept. You have to understand, this was something that would have kept Peter up at night. The amount of fish that came into the net start breaking. It's a kind of thing like, I mean, it's sort of, I'm thinking Peter probably is coming home after this day and saying, honey, look, you wanted that trip to the Bahamas? We're doing the trip to the Bahamas. Okay, we've got the money to do that now. Kids, you want to go to Disneyland? We're going to Disneyland now. We've got the money now. This is what Peter's thinking. He's seeing dollar signs. But then something even more strange happens. Peter looks to Jesus and he says, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord. Now, if we go back to the beginning of this story, you see that Peter calls him master. Now, in the Greek, that wording is ambiguous. It could be teacher, it could be master. But when he says, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord, that word Lord is exclusive. There's something of God that Peter sees in that moment. He knows that he is not just in the presence of another guy, another teacher, another rabbi. He says, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord. This is the kind of language that guys in the Old Testament who would encounter God, who had visions of God, that's the kind of language they were using. And this is the kind of language Peter's using. He's confronted with God in this moment. Now, what does that say to us today? How does that speak to the question? First, this story tells us that God is personal. God is personal. What do I mean? Well, just think about what happened, the chronology of the story. It's Jesus who actually initiates the conversation. It's Jesus who says, look, Peter, can I use your boat? I need to sit down and just teach people here. Peter, put your nets out in the deep. Jesus is the one who initiates the conversation. And this picks up on the bigger story, the grand narrative of the Bible. A story of God pursuing you, pursuing me, initiating the conversation. Christianity is not a story about somehow we get something right and then God intervenes, then God acts. It's a story of actually God coming to us while we were still messed up and broken. The scriptures say, Christ died for us while we were still sinners. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Do you know this God? God who pursues you. God is personal. He also speaks. God speaks. And when God speaks to us, the language he uses is deeply personal. Everything in Peter's life changed from this moment on. Now, I realize that we overuse sometimes that turn of phrase, life-changing. This changed my life. But in this moment for Peter, the whole way in which Peter viewed the world was altered. God, through Christ, was speaking to Peter. And it was deeply personal. Now, have you ever had the chance to talk to someone famous before? Has it ever happened to you before? Maybe a celebrity, maybe an actor, maybe an athlete. Has that ever happened to you before? Okay. Now, there are a few of you. I will never forget having the opportunity to talk to one of my childhood heroes, a guy named Joe Carter. Now, this is going to date me a bit, but Joe Carter was the face of the franchise for the Toronto Blue Jays back in the early 90s when they won back-to-back World Series. And I drove down with family to spring training in Florida to see a couple of games. I remember it was way back in 1992. And we had sort of a ritual. After every game, we would go back and we would share stories of, okay, whose autograph did we get? Whose photo did we get? Which players did we talk to? And it was basically, me and my cousins were sort of in a circle, and it was just a bragging session. A time when we could say, well, I talked to this guy, and I got this guy's autograph. There was one day when I had an opportunity to talk to Joe Carter. Now, for those of you who don't know Joe Carter, for those of you who know Blue Jays, you'll know Jose Bautista, okay? Joe Carter was basically the Jose Bautista of today, okay? Face of the franchise, the guy who you wanted to see at home plate when there was a moment. It was, just that kind of guy. There's a moment in which I got to meet Joe Carter. That day, we get back to the hotel. We're sitting in a circle, swapping stories, and my cousin looks to me and says, did you talk to anyone today? And I said, oh, yes, I did. And he said, well, who did you talk to? I said, well, I talked to Joe Carter. He said, you did? I said, yeah, I did. I did talk to Joe Carter. He said, well, what did he say? And I said, well, he said, how are you doing? And my cousin said, well, what did you say? And I said, good. Doing good. My cousin looked at me and said, is that it? And I said, yes. That 15 to 30-second exchange put me over the moon with excitement. But it was so superficial. Hi, how are you doing? Good. The end. But just think that the God who created you, he speaks to you. He speaks to you, and when he speaks, it's profoundly personal. That's what happens to Peter in this moment. God speaks. Do you know his voice? He might be speaking to you right now in this moment. Do you know his voice? God is personal. God speaks. And he is with us. When we talk about the Christian God, we are talking about a God who never leaves us alone. What I find interesting about this story is that Jesus instructs Peter to do something, but then he stays with him. And the reason why I find that to be interesting is because I think of Jesus as a pretty busy guy. Okay? If you read the Gospels, you just have to read one section, one chunk of the Gospels in the New Testament to see that Jesus was a guy who was in high demand. Okay? People wanted him to heal them, deliver them, talk to them, listen to them, just pray for them. I mean, there were a lot of things that people wanted Jesus to do. He was a busy guy. So I can imagine, I would not be surprised if Luke here tells us a story of Jesus looking to Peter and saying, look, Peter, look, you've got to go do this. I want you to cast your nets out in the deep. And look, I've got a 12 o'clock. I've got a 1 o'clock. why don't we debrief about this 2:30, okay? And we get a coffee and you tell me how that goes. He was a busy guy. But the reason why Jesus does not do that is because Jesus was initiating a personal relationship. It was not a business transaction. He was with Peter the entire time. He was in the boat with him. We have this assurance that when we accept Christ's invitation of a personal relationship, we are never alone. He is always with us. He's personal. He speaks. He's with us. And the Christian God is not boring. He is not boring. In other words, there's constant newness when we enter into